Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Jacobin Show. We are joined today by Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad to talk about their book, The Withdrawal: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, I wanted to start by talking through the way you frame the book. And the book is based off of a discussion, transcripts of a discussion that you both had. But you use this metaphor of the Godfather, a mafia boss, to discuss U.S. military and geopolitical power. Why did you use this framework? And what about U.S. foreign policy specifically are you trying to shine light on with that metaphor?
I think it's a pretty reasonable first approximation to a theory of international relations. So take the United States since 1945 it basically replaced Britain as the world dominant power. Britain reluctantly became what the British Foreign Office called a junior partner to the United States. The US, of course, had overwhelming power at the end of the Second World War, nothing remotely like it in history. And there was intelligent planning. We have detailed records of it. Every area of the world was assigned what was called its function within the overall system that would be dominated by the United States. So, for example, Southeast Asia, the function was to provide raw materials, resources to the former colonial powers in Europe so that they could reconstruct within the US-dominated framework. Africa was George Kennan, who was head of the State Department planning staff, who wrote this. He said, we're not much interested in Africa, so we can hand it over to Europe to exploit, his word, to exploit for its reconstruction. And it'll give the Europeans a sense that they have something gratifying. We're taking everything away from them, but they'll have Africa to exploit, and so on through the world. Well, there is what the United States calls a rules-governed international order, a term you hear all the time. The US does not accept the United Nations international order. It helped formulate it, but doesn't accept it. It can't, because the UN system rules out US foreign policy. It bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. So obviously the US can't accept that. So we accept the rules-based order where we set the rules and we are effectively the Godfather. Kind of run like the Mafia. If some small storekeeper doesn't pay his protection money, you send in your goons to smash him up, even if you don't need the money. So if Maurice Bishop in Grenada starts fishing cooperatives under the Carter administration, that's a no-no. So you have to send 6,000 special force Marines and special forces to overcome the resistance of 40 Cuban construction workers who already said they're perfectly willing to make an accommodation. Then we can stand tall and be heroic and settle that issue. And so it goes one after the other. The world runs very much like the Mafia. The Godfather is in charge. He sets the rules-based international order, and everyone else had better obey or else. Sometimes there are people who don't obey. In fact, one of the problem with China right now is that China refuses to obey. That's a problem. Europe obeys. When the US imposes sanctions on Cuba and Iran, Europe doesn't like it, but they adhere to it. China ignores the Godfather, and that's intolerable. That's what's called the China threat in US affairs. And a good deal of, I don't want to exaggerate, not everything works this way, but I say it's a pretty good first approximation to the way the world works.
If I could add to that, there's a contemporary set of examples for that. Let's take the case of the United States and the African continent. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, was in Ghana and Uganda. Whilst in Ghana, she made a number of statements warning African countries, 55 of them, telling them not to trade with Russia and China. She was quite forthright. Now, that's interesting. Just before the ambassador went to the African continent, and just before US Secretary of State Antony Blinken followed her to say much the same thing, there was a visit to some African countries by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Interestingly, Mr. Lavrov didn't say to African countries, don't trade with the United States. Now, you may have all kinds of problems with Russia, and believe me, there are lots of problems with Russia. But on the public record, the Russians weren't going around telling people, and the Chinese certainly don't do this, don't trade with the United States. But seemingly, it's perfectly accurate, it's perfectly acceptable to sections of the liberal media, including liberal media in the United States, the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, that high officials of the United States government can go around the African continent and say, we are telling you what to do. That sort of what Noam calls the Godfather attitude is treated as perfectly normal. Now, interestingly, Linda Thomas Greenfield, in one of the interviews she gave in Accra, said that US foreign policy on Africa, US foreign policy in Africa is an open book. That was the phrase she used. Well, let's open the book. What open book is she reading? If you go back to the 1960s, there was great anxiety in the US ruling class circles because the tendency of the freedom movement in the Congo was towards the left. And indeed, Patrice Lumumba wins a fair and square election to head his government. Now, why was the United States bothered by an election in the Congo which elected Patrice Lumumba? So bothered that US intelligence worked with Belgian intelligence and British intelligence, not only to overthrow Mr. Lumumba, but to assassinate him in 1961. What was the problem? I'm offering the ambassador a book to read. She should read a book called White Malice, recently come out, which demonstrates using archives in the United States and in the United Kingdom that the reason the United States was so bothered with Lumumba is that there is a uranium mine in the Congo at Shinkolbe. This mine is the mine from which the United States sourced uranium for the bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States couldn't allow the Congolese to trade uranium with the Soviet Union. And that's the reason they enter and conduct undemocratic, that's a charitable word to use, an undemocratic coup against the people of the Congo. So it's an open book, but what book are you reading? And that's the reason why the term Godfather is so valuable, because it shows you how normal that behavior is and how much nobody blinks an eye when people like, very nice people, by the way, Linda Thomas Greenfield, awfully nice person, when they say things like this, it's taken as fact, not as ideology. And I think that's the real concern here.
Yeah, it's really clear throughout the book that the terms are set by the United States, the conversation is set by the United States, and the military and economic interventions serve as internal and external discipline. So they are externally disciplining anybody who dares, break or deviate from any of the rules set out at any moment. And they're internally disciplining, allies in other countries who generally follow along, but it's showing constantly the might of the United States and what happens if you step a toe out of line. speaking to what you were saying with the China threat, this has recently been in the news because of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and I'd like both of you to comment on that. But you also talk about in the book about the way that China is trying to create systems that can meet or match or in some way contest U.S. power. And that's both economic, with the Belt and Road Initiative. You talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China has been doing development in Africa. And from what I've read in the mainstream news, the line is the Chinese don't mind working with corrupt leaders, so they're fine to build these infrastructure projects down there. But this seems like it gets to part of the core of the idea of the China threat. And there has been in the last week or so some escalating tensions. Can you talk about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and more generally, what is the threat from China? Is it an alternative global banking system like the SWIFT system? Is it a way of checking U.S. sanctions? Is it a way of checking U.S. military power? Can you speak to that?
Well, with regard to Pelosi, this was a very reckless act of personal aggrandizement. It's obviously trying to beef up her CV and show that she can be as tough as the craziest lunatic male that you can find. There was no other reason for it. For 50 years, there's been a basic agreement about Taiwan. It's called the One China policy. It's agreed that China's part of Taiwan's part of China, and that China and the United States will stay in a state of strategic ambiguity, as it's called. They tacitly agree that neither of them will do anything to overthrow the status quo by force. Okay, that's kept for 50 years of peace, few breaks, very successful policy. In recent years, the United States has been increasing provocations, which China responds to. Same in this case. Pelosi's visit was a major provocation. China didn't shoot down her plane, as they could have. They simply responded by a demonstration that China can close off Taiwan, blockade it, so that they will strangle it. It's a rock in the ocean, lives on trade. China surrounds it with military force. It's stuck, it'll collapse. So China carried out military maneuvers showing that. They also imposed some sanctions on Taiwan and also breaks with the United States, simply to show we're not going to be pushed around. The sanctions are probably more serious than they look. So one of the things that China imposed was apparent. We don't have all details, but it seems that they imposed a ban on export of sand to Taiwan. Well, that doesn't sound like much until you think for a minute. Sand, Taiwan's a rock. If they want to build something, they need concrete. Concrete is based on sand. So China's saying, well, you fool around, we can undercut your economy very easily. We don't have to invade. That's basically the message. Now, we have to recognize that the US provocations go way beyond Taiwan. The United States recently has been running a huge naval operation, multinational naval operation, RIMPAC it's called, with all threatening China in the Pacific, major operations. The US has established what it calls a sentinel states to encircle China, hostile states run by the United States, Biden provided precision weapons, which hadn't been there before, to be able to target China. U.S. nuclear submarines have the capacity to destroy China, in fact, the world. But they're all surrounding it. There's an agreement with Australia, which one of Australia's leading strategic analysts called Clinton Fernandez, called a sub-imperial country, which serves U.S. power as a base for U.S. power in the region. There's a deal to provide the AUKUS deal, it's called, provide Australia with nuclear submarines, which can seriously threaten China in the South China Sea, claim to be able to just sink its fleet if they want to, monitor Chinese operations there. The Quad, so it's called, is South Korea, Japan, Australia, Japan, United States, and India. India is a reluctant partner, doesn't want to participate in this game. But the idea is to surround and circle China with hostile powers, which will prevent it from breaking out, doing anything. Now, that's constant, severe threats. What's the threat of China? I think it's what I said before. They're there. Actually, the former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, well-known international statesman, had an article in the Australian press asking what actually is the threat of China? What are we worried about? He ran through the reasons, and none of them make any sense. I said the real threat of China is there. It's there, and it refuses to follow orders. Here, I think we can go back to the Godfather image. Take, say, Cuba. Why does the United States devote such extraordinary efforts to torture and destroy Cuba? There's no precedent for it in history, in fact. Like right now, Cuba has a huge fire. It's getting support from Mexico, from Venezuela, not the United States. You have to strangle and torture the Cubans. Well, we know the reason. I go back to State Department records in the 1960s, very explicit. The threat of Castro is his successful defiance of policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which stated the intention of the United States to dominate the hemisphere. Couldn't do it then. Britain was too strong, but they understood sooner or later the US would be able to do it. And in fact, in 1898, the United States did intervene in Cuba, what's called here the liberation of Cuba, what in fact was the prevention of the liberation of Cuba from Spain. The US intervened to prevent it, turned Cuba into a virtual colony. As soon as Cuba broke out of that in 1959, attacks began. Since then, they've been carrying out successful defiance. And the Godfather doesn't accept that. Doesn't matter whether there are any resources or not. Just to add a comment on what Vijay said about the Congo. My own feeling is even if the Congo hadn't had uranium, they still would have killed Lumumba, because the Congo is the richest, most powerful part of Africa. If it succeeds in developing, it'll bring all Africa along with it. The US not having that. So Lumumba was assassinated. The Belgian got there first, but CIA had him on their hit list. Then they installed a kleptomaniac murderer who would follow US orders, just to make sure that Congo doesn't move towards successful defiance or anybody else. Well, that's China. China is not going to be pushed around. They have several thousand years of history. They went through a century of humiliation, ended with the Maoist revolution. They're not going to accept it again. The Belt and Road Initiative is a huge initiative of investment and development. you're quite right. They're perfectly willing to work with anyone, corrupt, non-corrupt. Just build this system, which is China-based, includes most of Asia already, moving to Africa, even moving to Latin America, US backyard. US can't stop it. Moving to the Middle East, even Israel. So China owns half the Haifa port. Well, US doesn't like it, but doesn't have the ability to stop it. The United Arab Emirates is a key to the Chinese, what's called maritime Silk Route, which reaches to the Red Sea onto the way of moving towards Europe, which will probably want to join this. It's much too rich an area to avoid. China's just moving steadily, slowly, no violence, investment, development. The US can't do anything about it. It's going crazy. It's part of the reason for the hysteria about China now. I mean, the hysteria is just beyond discussion. So take something like the United States is collapsing from within. We all know that. The bridges are collapsing, the subways don't work, nothing works, the health system doesn't work. So we need spending to rebuild the United States. Well, finally, Congress got together and did agree to a bill for some construction of infrastructure, not because the United States needs bridges, because we have to outcompete China. It's the China competition bill. I mean, this is pathological, but it shows when the Godfather is in trouble, he goes crazy.
Just to, again, build a little on what Noam was saying. First, I just want to say from a personal standpoint, I think it's important for intellectuals, different kinds of people to interact with each other across all kinds of barriers. I've been a great proponent of interacting with people that one doesn't agree with. I think it's a good part of the human experience. So, for the past, decade, more than the past decade, I've developed very close relationships with intellectuals in China. I've held conversations with them. I've spent time talking to Zhang Weiwei, leading intellectual. He was the translator of Deng Xiaoping. Spent a lot of time talking with somebody I deeply respect, Wang Hui, teaches at Tsinghua University, and so on. These connections by themselves have, for some people, been a red rag to the bull, because they claim that any contact with China is somehow has you, in fact, influenced by China, as if, for instance, I don't have my own brain. In other words, it goes back to a debate from an earlier period when George W. Bush, borrowing from Samuel Huntington, began to use the kind of clash of civilizations rhetoric, hyped up between Christianity and Islam at the time. Now we're seeing a kind of clash of civilizations rhetoric between the so-called West and Russia, China, and so on. At the time when George Bush began to talk in this clash of civilizations way, leading figures in Iran sent a letter to the United States government, in fact, directly to George W. Bush, where they said, rather than a clash of civilizations, can't we have a dialogue across civilizations? Strikes me that many of the Western governments, led by the United States, have lost the appetite for both diplomacy and dialogue. Strikes me that, the demonization of people substitutes for a mature attitude toward them. Look, frankly, the United States knows that in many areas of economic life, high-speed rail, green technology, even now some areas of computerization, certainly telecommunications, Chinese firms can produce goods as good as the United States, as efficient as the United States, and of course cheaper than US firms, even when US firms produce these goods in China. So Apple phones produced in China are much more expensive than Huawei phones. Rather than merely compete commercially, the United States has decided to utilize its diplomatic, military, and ideological force to intimidate China into stop developing its own technological capacity. And there used to be a familiar word for that, which nowadays doesn't get used in polite conversation much. The word for that was imperialism. You're using extra economic force to gain advantages. Why can't the United States get its act together, produce better phones, produce better technology at a cheaper price, produce green technology? Why can't it just compete with China, in the marketplace? Well, it can't, and it knows it can't. And therefore, it is willing to destroy the world in order to maintain its inefficient economic domination of the world. And I want to underline the use of that word. It is willing to push its inefficient economic domination of the world rather than take some lessons from other people, not only the Chinese, but other people who are producing things perhaps better, cheaper, and differently. But you can't, again, drawing from the word Noam uses often, you can't get the Godfather to learn new tricks. The Godfather's trick is to go to somebody's stable, take their favorite horse, cut off its head, and put it in your bed. That's what the Godfather knows. The Godfather doesn't understand how to convince or how to learn. And that, I think, is something young people in the United States, it's a lesson to take from this, is that learn how to do things better. Learn how to talk to other people. Don't use your muscle to maintain your power, because that is bringing the world near destruction or, well, annihilation. Okay. And I'm an optimistic person, but I'm afraid for that. I'm afraid this attitude is really bringing us to the brink of a war we can't imagine.
Yeah, what you've said echoes some of the examples in the book of this bizarre brinksmanship from the United States, where it essentially puts its foot down when other countries and territories sign nuclear treaties or offer conditions of surrender. You talk about this with Saddam Hussein. You list the 5 nuclear weapons free zones, and you talk about the United States' complete opposition to this. Do you think there's more going on here than muscle flexing? And if so, what is it?
Well, it's not just muscle flexing. Take the most crucial case, the Middle East nuclear free zone. It's coming up right now. As you know, of course, the United States, Trump pulled out of the joint agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons, which was working very successfully. U.S. intelligence agrees that Iran was living up to all the conditions. U.S. pulled out. Europe was strongly opposed. But as I said, they obey. They hate the U.S. sanctions, but they obey them. They're not like China. Now there are negotiations as to whether to reconstruct it. In the background is something everyone knows and no one is allowed to say. There's a very simple way to avoid any problem, real or imagined. I think mostly imagined, but even if you believe they're real, there's a very simple way to eliminate any threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. Impose a nuclear weapons free zone in the region with inspections, which work. We know that from the joint agreement. Why not? Arab states are strongly in favor of it. They've been pressing it for 25 years. Iran is in favor of it. The global south, G77, about 130 countries strongly in favor of it. Europe's raising no objections. So what's the problem? US won't allow it. Why won't the US allow it? Well, there's a country called Israel, which has a major nuclear weapons system, happens to be a US client. The US will not permit Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected. In fact, the US does not even officially recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. It claims we don't know, which of course is nonsense. Everyone knows. And there's a reason for that too. If the US were to acknowledge it, US law comes into play. And it can well be argued that US aid to Israel is illegal because of its development of nuclear weapons outside the international framework. Neither political party in the United States nor the intellectual community wants to open that door. So nobody will talk about this. So therefore, we may march into a war in the Middle East. It's a grave threat because we want to ensure that US aid to Israel is not threatened. You can't talk about this. Actually, if the American population was aware of this, I don't think they'd be very happy about it. So the press is very careful never to discuss it. The New York Times came close a couple of months ago and said, why don't we move towards a Persian Gulf nuclear weapons-free zone? Persian Gulf, omitting somebody. In fact, it added Israeli nuclear weapons are non-negotiable. Okay. Well, thank you for the editors for your honesty. Now we know what's going on. Israel's a loyal client state. It's a base for US power in the region, has been since 1967. We're not going to allow any interference with that. It's a sensible position on the part of the Godfather, and it might drive us to war in the Middle East, a major war. It's not the only case. So Africa wants to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone. Can't. The United States wants a nuclear weapons base in the island of Diego Garcia, which is part of Africa. It was a British colony. The British, the junior partner of the United States, obliged the Godfather by kicking out the population, driving them out, and violating UN orders and claiming it's part of the British Empire. Well, that's the role of the junior partner, the sub-imperialist, as Clinton Fernandez calls them. So Africa can't have a nuclear weapons-free zone. Pacific, same reason. US insists on having nuclear bases on its Pacific islands. This is not just showing your muscle. The nuclear bases on the Pacific islands threaten China. Okay, they're part of the encirclement of China, saying, we're ready to destroy you if you make a move, you know. All of this is logical imperial planning. You may not like it, but it's not irrational. It's very rational, thoughtful imperial planning. Can't say that in the United States. There's a doctrine called American exceptionalism, which says everything we do is benign, full of love of others. We invade Iraq, it's because we love them so much. Sometimes we make mistakes. Anybody can make mistakes, but we're just perfect power. It's interesting to look into how this works. I can talk about it. I'll just give you one example. There's one of the top, maybe the founder of modern hard-headed realist international relations theory, tough-minded, no nonsense, no sentimentality, Hans Morgenthau. He, a very good scholar, serious guy. He wrote a book called The Purpose of America. Other countries don't have purposes, but the US does. The purpose of America is to bring freedom and all good things to the world. And then he said he's a good scholar. He went through the record. He said it's kind of odd. If you look at the U.S. record, it always opposes the U.S. purpose. He says some people bring this up and say the purpose isn't real, but they're making a mistake. They're confusing the abuse of history with history. The abuse of history is what happened. History is the way it's reflected in our minds. So the way it's reflected in our minds is benign intentions gone awry. So that's history. Abuse of history is just what we do all the time. And he says, to make this confusion, he says, it's like the error of atheism, which denies God's benevolence by talking about bad things that happen. And we don't want to make the error of atheism. So we want our religion of worship of the state to be untouched. That's hard-headed realism. Then you go over to the sentimental guys. Well, all of this fits together.
Yeah, and you add to this the scandalous treatment of these events or of this history by the media. Noam already talked about the New York Times editorial page. And, what Noam was talking about was an editorial board statement, which quite cavalierly talked about this Persian Gulf nuclear-free zone and quite, nimbly said Israel is not to be part of this. Just very casual. The media, well, I'm a naive person. I've started my career as a journalist. I love reporting stories. I love the practice of journalism. So I always have this high-minded idea, that journalists must have this, purpose, to use the Hans Morgenthau word. Journalists should have this purpose, We should be out there to tell the story, to lift up stories from the shadows. It's curious that most journalists, or at least most publications, I know when journalists file stories, it's not exactly what appears, but most publications, when it comes to writing about those whom the United States picks out as adversaries, don't treat those adversaries as human. And I want to say this in this language. There's a kind of international division of humanity that gets set up. The North Koreans are simply not human. Many years ago, I remember reading a statement made by a Western journalist who said, we have a practice when we report on most countries or most events, we like to get one or two sources to get confirmation. He said, with North Korea, I can say anything. I can say that, the president is dead. And in fact, repeatedly, these stories appear, which are not based at all, in fact, on one defector's claim and so on. But it's not just a North Korea story. People laugh. You mention North Korea, they start laughing. It's not a North Korea story. As we show in the book, when it came to Iraq, repeatedly Saddam Hussein tried to cut a deal with the United States. Not interested. Media ignored Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a monster, had to be dispatched. No way there could be diplomacy. Gaddafi is a monster. There's no way that the media would report that the African Union had opened dialogue, that there were people on a plane ready to go and talk to Mr. Gaddafi. He was willing to dialogue and so on. You're not even allowed to imagine that the adversary, the Iranian, the Chinese, the Russian, you're not allowed to imagine that the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Nicaraguans have opinions. And if they have opinions can be debated and dialogued. But if you paint them as monsters, merely monsters, Maduro is a monster, Xi Jinping is a monster, and so on. Well, we know from our childhood story books, fairy tales, that monsters don't have opinions. You don't negotiate with the monster. I worry very much, Ariella, when I look at the reporting, particularly by the press in the United States, in the UK, maybe a little better on the continent of Europe, just a little better. And I really hesitate by even making that that statement. When you look at the media, this international division of humanity is just absolutely normal. It's perfectly acceptable to pillory people in Iran, politically, or perfectly acceptable to pillory Mr. Putin. Again, you might have problems with him. Mr. Putin has a lot to answer for. It's true. I'm going back to the Chechnya war. There's a long history, lots of problems. On the other hand, Mr. Putin, won an election. Now you can say, well, the election system in Russia is corrupt. But who's the you that's saying that? The senator from Texas, which has a terribly corrupt political system, the president of the United States, who was elected by an arcane slavery era electoral college system. I mean, okay, you have problems with the way the election system in Russia is set up. You have problems with that. You set it up. Remember that after the fall of the Soviet Union, US advisors went there. They set up the system. They liked the system then because Mr. Yeltsin, the first president, 1991 to 1999, was completely subservient to the United States. Nobody criticized the Russian political system then, even though I believe it's 97 when Mr. Yeltsin patently stole the election. Nobody complained then. When Mr. Putin comes to power in 1999, until around 2004, 5, 6, 7, the United States had no problem with him. In fact, Thomas Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, we're rooting for Putin, in his folksy Thomas Friedman language. Rooting for Putin. That was less than a decade ago. The problem, again, just to return to our principal theme, is if somebody says, look, I'm not going to follow your orders, then they go on the other side of the international division of humanity. And suddenly Putin, rooting for Putin, becomes Putin the dictator. The moment you say, I don't agree with you, you go not to somebody with whom you don't agree, because that's acceptable. I don't agree with somebody. But you go to the other side of this membrane called the international division of humanity. Your humanity is denied you. You become a monster. And then the only language that you claim they understand is the language of force and violence. The way Saddam Hussein went from being the close ally of the United States, great friend of Donald Rumsfeld and so on, suddenly crosses the membrane, becomes this monster. Previously, you palled around with him in Baghdad, then he becomes a monster. And then the only language he is supposed to understand, even though he's writing to you and saying, let's negotiate, how can we settle this? No, you say, we don't understand you, especially your brand of Arabic. You only speak Exocet missiles and so on from that era. And it's this that seriously is disturbing, that the US media and large parts of the Western media in general simply has this attitude that certain people don't need to be taken seriously. We don't need to report what they're saying, not even asking you to agree with them, but we're not even going to report what they're saying.
Yeah, I think there's a thread there where there is this concept of American exceptionalism, America as the kind of humanitarian police of the world, always benevolent, always interceding so that American values can take seed in other countries. And yet because of that principle and because of the humanitarian divide that you've described, Vijay, we get a constant state of exception, which is a term that I'm borrowing from Giorgio Agamben, which is that because there is a sense that all military intervention by the United States is for the good of humanity, and we define who's human, there is no such thing as collateral damage. There is no cost to civilian casualties. There is no long-term squalor, brutality, and division created by these things. It can only lead to a just outcome. And it's been interesting for me because I came of age during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which I watched in real time turn into these propagandized talking points. And it was bizarre. It was the first kind of moment in my life where I could see this narrative shift, where suddenly some people were subhuman. And I had experienced it, being Black in America in a different way. But seeing this on this massive scale, watching the bombings, watching the bombings of Iraq and the trial of Saddam, it was striking and life-changing for me, because you saw what happens when an entire nation of people are no longer defined as human beings. And for me, being Black in America, it's my history as well. It's why people that I come from were brought here. But I wanted to talk about grounding this in what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq now, because we have sort of largely started ignoring it. After the US withdrew from Afghanistan, there were a series of stories focusing on the humanitarian crises left in the wake. I did see in Pennsylvania a billboard of Joe Biden with a sort of Taliban-esque outfit on, saying, "Thanks, Joe, love the Taliban." I saw it turned into a Republican talking point, but now it seems largely ignored. And the people in both countries, both Iraq and Afghanistan, are suffering. Iraq currently is experiencing a heat wave, I think, with temperatures going over 50 degrees Celsius. There are infrastructure issues, which are no doubt caused by U.S. military action there. Afghanistan is facing a humanitarian crisis, the scale of which I find it's hard to even reckon with. Can you talk about what's happening there? And how do we put the United States' feet to the fire to talk about accountability in those regions?
Well, just one background comment on American exceptionalism. There's nothing exceptional about it. Our predecessors in imperial domination were exactly the same. The British were the most angelic country in history while they were destroying India, carrying out hideous slavery in the Caribbean, one massive crime after another. British intellectuals were hailing themselves as utterly angelic. We're so marvelous, nobody even understands us. So the French are even worse. So this is just imperial behavior. Afghanistan now is first of all, it is a total catastrophe. I mean, huge numbers of tens of millions of people are facing starvation. There's food in the market. They can't access their bank accounts, those who have money to buy food, while they see their children starving. The United States holds their money. It's in US banks. Won't release it because of claims that US citizens want a potential compensation for 9/11, which Afghans had absolutely nothing to do with. This is so scandalous. I can't even find words to discuss it. It's a hideous situation. Even releasing the funds would come nowhere near solving the problem. We spent 20 years destroying the country. It's barely functioning. I think it's pretty clear what we ought to be doing if there was a shred of humanity in policy formation. Well, what can we do about it? We all know the answer. First thing we have to do is bring people to understand the facts of the matter, the bare facts of the matter. Then move on to say, look, as people, we do have moral instincts. Maybe states don't, but people do. So let's act on them. But let's start with the beginning. This goes back to something Vijay said before about negotiations. Why did we invade Afghanistan? There's no reason for it, no justification at all. The U.S., fact of the matter is, the U.S. had no idea who carried out the 9/11 attack. Even 8 months after the invasion, head of the FBI, Robert Mueller's first press conference, conceded that we suspect that Al-Qaeda was responsible, but we really don't know. So they invaded with no knowledge of anything. The probably best explanation for the invasion was given by the leading figure of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, Abdul Haq, highly regarded Afghan leader, had an interview. He was asked, why did the US invade? He said, look, the invasion is going to kill lots of Afghans. It's undermining our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within. But the US doesn't care. They want to show their muscle and intimidate everyone. That's probably correct. You look at the record, it supports it. The Taliban made many offers to release Al-Qaeda, even though the US wouldn't provide any evidence about Osama bin Laden, didn't have any, in fact. Nevertheless, worked out various options. Finally, they just said, look, we'll surrender totally. You can do what you like. Donald Rumsfeld responded, we do not negotiate. George Bush echoed it. No negotiations. We're just going to show our muscle and intimidate everyone. We'll smash up Afghanistan because we don't know what else to do. We've got the force. Nobody can defend themselves from it. So we'll just smash you to a pulp and intimidate everyone. If they'd wanted to capture Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, they could have done it with a police operation, with the Afghans probably agreeing. But no, so we had to smash up Afghanistan and then go on for another 20 years, making it worse. Now they're starving to death, so we have to withhold their funds. I'd like to see an editorial in the New York Times describing this. It's approximately what it is. So the first thing is bring it to the public, find out what we did. We can go back further, and there's no time to talk about it, but it's very interesting to look at the US reaction when the Russians invaded. Just brief fact of the matter is the UN organized diplomatic effort, which was finally successful, for the Russians to withdraw. The US was trying to block it all the way, right to the end. The US tried to block the Russian withdrawal, which was being worked out diplomatically by the UN. We actually have a definitive source on that now, a book by Cordovez and Harrison, the UN diplomat involved, and one of the leading US experts on Afghanistan. What they conclude is the US was fighting Russia to the last Afghan. Does that sound familiar? It's happening right now in Ukraine. Yes, people ought to know about those things. And then they can have a basis, at least, for reacting as human beings would, not slaves of the propaganda system. And I think they would. I think if you can get people to understand what's happening, they will respond humanely. Anyway, that's the only hope we have.
I wanted to talk about a term that you guys use in your discussion, which is military Keynesianism. And I'd like you to speak about what that is, because there's this aha moment, I think, that happens when you're describing this sort of strategy. And it's similar to a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's a public school teacher, and she was talking about how she's scared to teach because of school shootings and the absurd, sadistic, and bizarre Republican I guess, suggestions that we arm teachers. And I think in Ohio, there was a cap on training teachers to use guns so they could get 24 hours of training, and that's it. But I said, well, this it's not hypocritical, because the Republican Party may claim to care about children, but what they care about the most is dismantling the public school system in America. And what better way to do that than fill it with guns and keep it violent and terrifying? And I think when you pull back from hypocrisy, you find something that makes it cohesive. It's like you said earlier, Noam, it's not that these strategies are irrational. It's not that they're wasteful, even. It's just that we haven't put our finger on what the overarching goal is. And I think that your discussion of military Keynesianism does this. We hear over and over that the United States military has a bloated, massive budget. We have bases all over the world. You have described efforts to stymie nuclear weapons treaties, which seems absurd to any person who cares about their lives or the lives of others. This, for me, felt like a overarching way of understanding some of those actions. Can you talk about that term?
Well, I think there are several factors involved in what you described. One of them is destroying the public education system. That's very significant. Mass public education back in the late 19th, early 20th century was one of the major contributions that the United States made to general democracy. The United States pioneered mass public education. It had plenty of flaws. So, for example, the college system, mass public education at the college level, that was made possible simply by genocidal destruction of the indigenous population and stealing their lands. A little footnote in the background for the great state universities. But now, putting that little footnote aside, establishing state universities and a kindergarten educational system was a major contribution to democracy. It's hated by the business world. Why? It's, first of all, they don't want anything out of their control. And then it gives people the wrong ideas. It gives them the idea that you can get together through the public system and do things that are good. You don't want people to have that idea. The idea that must be in people's heads is the only thing that can do anything good is private tyrannies. That's what a corporation is. Private tyranny, controlled from above, unaccountable to the population. That's called libertarian in the United States. Interesting term. But we have to have the country run by unaccountable private tyrannies. Okay? So the idea that the public can do anything decent is very dangerous. So let's kill public education, kill the post office, kill public transportation. There's a way of doing this, a standard way. What you do is first defund them. Defund them so they don't work. Then people get upset and they'll agree to have something else. So when Margaret Thatcher wanted to destroy the British railway system, defund it. Start getting accidents, trains don't run on time. Say, let's do something else. Sell it to somebody who can make profit from it, then it'll be worse. Okay, that happens over and over. So for the last 40 years have been an interesting period. It's called the neoliberal period. And neoliberalism has all kind of fancy words like let the market reign and so on. It's nonsense. Neoliberalism is bitter, brutal class war, conscious class war to destroy the general population, place them under the control of private power. If you use the market, no market, doesn't matter. Any technical word. One of the aspects of this is destroy public education. So it's been defunded from the lowest level to the top. You can read an article today about how at the college level, academics and scientists are just pulling out. They're refusing to take the jobs because they're not worth it. They can make more in private industry. They're subject to tons of bureaucracy. They don't get pensions. Why bother? Well, that's part of the system. Why should there be any public system that people benefit from? It's kind of the same as defunding the post office. Why should there be an effective system that works very well for everyone and is under public control? So getting rid of education is part of that. The business of arming teachers is, I mean, you may have seen a joke somewhere about a teacher being prepared to teach kindergarten by having a training in how to shoot a gun, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, let's make them hostile places. You ask Ted Cruz, what should be done about schools? More barricades, more guns, police at the door. Wonderful environment for kindergarten students. But let's have it, then we'll control them. So as far as military Keynesianism is concerned, you have to look at that quite carefully. Everyone has heard of Eisenhower's speech, military-industrial complex. Industrial is not a small part of it. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the United States had something we're supposed to oppose. It's called industrial policy, state industrial policy to develop the economy. We're supposed to condemn that when China does it. That's why we have what we're now using, computers, internet, satellites, almost all of it came out of the state system through the Pentagon. Pentagon is the way you can get money out of Congress without them making a fuss about it. And so you want to build an internet, let's call it the defense something or other. You want to build the interstate highway system back in the 50s, let's call it the defense highway system. Then Congress will pay for it. A large part of the modern economy, high-tech economy, comes from large-scale state intervention through the research universities, government laboratories, and so on. That goes up to the present. I mean, take the Moderna vaccine. Comes mostly from research in the public system, handed over to private corporations, so you get a couple of billionaires out of it. That's the way the system does. So when we talk about military Keynesianism, we should recognize that this is part of the way in which the corporate system uses the state for their own benefit. Sometimes producing things which are useful, sometimes not. That's irrelevant. They're mainly for profit. So the whole military Keynesian thing is a complex story.
You know, just to come into that complex story a little bit, one of the historical and theoretical features of capitalism is that the system is very rarely in equilibrium. There are often periods of great growth, and then there are periods of great collapse. People later tried to justify this, analyzing the historical data and saying there are business cycles, as if to say it's a normal thing that there's a collapse. Well, when you look at a business cycle, a collapse can mean the deterioration of livelihood for very large numbers of people. So one shouldn't be cavalier about that. What is generally called Keynesianism is the belief that in a time of the business cycle downward movement, from the trough, the peak downward, governments can enter because private capital, what Noam called the private tyranny, is unable to actually invest at a time of downward, when the economy is going downhill. They don't want to invest then because they are also feeling insecure. They generally keep their money outside, or they invest in things that are secure. At the time, people like Keynes, not only Keynes, but people like Keynes, others as well, argued that governments need to intervene and invest in a counter-cyclical fashion. That is to say, invest against the cycle. So when the economy is going downhill, governments can come in and they can put money into infrastructure spending. That, for instance, is exactly what the New Deal was. The New Deal, the spending on bridges and so on in the United States, was a form of counter-cyclical spending. In fact, Paul Sweezy and others, very good technical economists actually looked at a long period of data in the United States, and they suggested that most counter-cyclical spending in the US was not on the social side of the budget. In other words, it was not on expenditure for public education, improving, roofs in schools and raising the pensions of the teachers and so on. It wasn't to build bridges. It wasn't to build public rail. It wasn't to build public goods, actually, is what Sweezy and others found. Because the building of public goods is a key part of government spending. What they found was that the bulk of counter-cyclical spending was actually in the military side. Now, by 2022, you don't actually need to do a major study, longitudinal study of US government spending. We know that an enormous, obscene part of the US budget goes towards the military. We say 700 billion, but it's actually closer to $1 trillion, because you have to add in the parts of the US budget that goes to the Department of Energy, which manages the maintenance of nuclear weapons and so on. It's closer to $1 trillion if you add in the CIA budget, which we don't know, the National Security Agency budget, which we don't know, and so on. So this counter-cyclical spending done on the military side is generally known as military Keynesianism. Now, why? Noam has answered the question, but I want to just emphasize it. Why has the United States, set apart from, say, Sweden, and I'm not a big champion of the Swedish system, but you can actually compare the two. In Sweden, there's a lot of counter-cyclical spending, but it happens on the social side of the ledger. Why in the United States does it happen on the military side? It's a good question to actually ask mainstream political scientists. It's a good question to ask politicians and so on. The one answer that should be on the table, and actually there's enough evidence, published evidence from high officials of the United States government to validate this answer. One answer is that when you build the public goods sector, the social wages, you improve public schools, you create public transportation, you build a public health system, you build universally free higher education, you build creches for young children, preschools and so on, all of this in the public domain. If you do all that, you give people a taste of socialism. You give people a real taste of socialism, because also people who are elites are sending their children to school or using the same hospitals as working people. So now you don't want to see these facilities deteriorate. You see, if the elite abdicates from public goods, if the elite sends their children to private school, use private hospital, use private transportation, then the elite is not going to care if public goods are in really bad shape. So when everybody is put in the same boat, you start getting a taste of socialism. It looks like, from whatever scattered statements exist in the public domain, it looks like in the United States, there was almost a decision, particularly after the New Deal, to no longer do massive public spending on the social side as part of the counter-cyclical, the normal counter-cyclical policy. Instead, the US government actually balances economic turbulence by spending on the military. And that's why I believe that US military spending is actually quite rational. If you accept the premises of the US ruling elite, who don't want to use this massive social wealth to create a public good. In fact, in the United States, you could cut your military budget by half, and you would still have a larger military than anybody around the planet. Then you can put some of that social wealth towards bringing down your debt, towards creating social goods that improve the lives of people who live inside the United States. But no, that's out of the question. And again, not to belabor this, this is a decision of the Godfather. Who are you going to question? You can't ask them to change their mind. They've got a settled opinion. There's no space either, of course, no space with the Republican Party, But where's the space with the Democratic Party to have this conversation?
Just and that what Vijay just described was in fact discussed quite publicly and openly in the business press in the late 1940s. If you read Business Week, other journals, they understood that we're going to have some kind of counter-cyclic spending. And they concluded that it could be social spending, could be military spending. They'd both work. But the social spending has a downside. And it's pretty much what Vijay just described. They didn't use the word socialism. They said democracy. They said public spending people care about. If you're going to build a mass transportation system, people have opinions, should be here, not there. If you say, I'm building jet planes, nobody has an opinion. Of course, the military experts do it. So we want to do the kind of spending in which the public is out of it. The public doesn't participate. They just listen. That, in fact, is liberal democratic theory. Public are spectators. They don't participate. So you don't want to have the kinds of policies in which people will automatically participate, become active politically, become agents, want to determine what's done and so on. That's completely wrong. People are supposed to be in the workplace following orders and push a button every once in a while. It's called an election, but nothing else. So therefore, the military, they said, is a much better option. Now, military, remember, doesn't just mean military. It's not just Lockheed. It's also General Motors, General Electric. In fact, a large part of the industrial system is involved in military production. So there's profit across the board. And nobody's asking about it because it's all for defense against some horrible monster who's about to destroy us. And so this has to go side by side with concocting enormous monsters ready to destroy us tomorrow. But it does fit together as a reasonable ruling class strategy.
So the last chapter of the book is about U.S. fragility, or the fragility of U.S. power. What is causing U.S. power to decline? What is causing its fragility? And do you see the Godfather figure losing some of its might?
Well, my own feeling is the fragility is mostly from within. We've constructed a dysfunctional society. It's tearing itself to shreds. No country is capitalist. A capitalist society would destroy itself in 5 minutes. So all the economies around the world are one or another variety of state capitalist. The last 40 years, we have been under a form of state capitalism, which is unusually savage and rapacious. State power is used for the benefit of the super rich and the corporate sector. Reagan took off with Reagan, Clinton continued it, went wild with Trump, but it's been essentially bipartisan. And it's had effects. It's been very effective class war. To give one measure, Rand Corporation did a study last year, I'm sure you've seen it, of the transfer of wealth from the general population to the top 1%. Their estimate is about $50 trillion in the last 40 years. And it's very effective highway robbery. And it's also been accompanied by deterioration of the social order. Things like schools, infrastructure, post office, whatever you turn to. Let's just destroy everything for the benefit of the super rich and the corporations. Now, there's plenty of state intervention involved. This is not markets. The World Trade Organization, for example, Clinton era, it's called free trade agreements, highly protectionist, massive protection for major corporations, what are called intellectual property rights, which never existed in the past. massive patent protection so that drug companies can charge you 10 times as much as is needed for a drug. And then the pressure of the wealthy on Congress keeps it from being changed. We're seeing that right in front of our eyes right now. So it's a very effective form of control of the state to intervene massively for the benefit of the rich, the ultra-rich corporate sector. Everyone else suffers. Public society collapses. I think that's a large part of the fragility of the country. It's a way of destroying a country so the rich can survive. When we talk about the American economy declining, that's highly misleading. U.S. corporation, if you look at GDP on national accounts, GDP for the country, yes, it's declining. There's one very good political economist, Sean Stars, who's done something else. He studied the amount of global wealth owned by US-based multinationals. It's spectacular. It's probably about half of global wealth. So, Apple doesn't make computers that compete with Huawei, but they're still the $1 trillion corporation. They're making plenty of money. They've worked on a program of globalization, which destroys the American working class, but stuffs their pockets with huge profits. Okay, so is that from one point of view, it's American decline, but depends what you call America. If by America you keep the corporate sector, the guys who run the place, it's not declining. It's doing very well for itself while smashing everyone else in the face. That's what's called class war.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good reason why the word is fragility and not decline. There are some sectors, because power is not just one, along one vector. Power comes in different ways. Military power, there's no decline. The United States has the ability to smash any country. Now, people mistake the fact that the US had to withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan and couldn't perhaps attain its stated war aims as a sign of military weakness. No, it's a sign of political weakness. But they have enormous military power, the capacity to blow anybody up. I mean, they've been killing Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda, every few years. It's incredible. I mean, they have such great drone strike capacity that after having killed him, they go and strike him in heaven or hell or wherever he is. They recently killed him again. So they have incredible military power. The economic power is intact. I mean, it's fragile, but it still exists, and their power over economic institutions is there. The fact that the US can continue to sanction Venezuela and Cuba, as Noam said at the beginning, in the midst of this fire in Matanzas, the criminal blockade of Cuba is maintained because of power over economic institutions such as International Monetary Fund, the SWIFT system, and so on. But there's a fragility. The way in the recent year, the way in which the Mexican president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, has been talking to the United States is a sign of increasing confidence in a country like Mexico. The fact that in Colombia, of all countries, never had a left government since 1810, that Gustavo Petro can come to power and give, dear old Ted Cruz nightmare after nightmare. Ted Cruz is petrified by what's happening in South America, as he should be. But you see, this new confidence, we're seeing the Indian government saying, look, we can't agree with you on Ukraine. Or we're seeing the majority of African states saying, look, we can't agree with you on Ukraine. All of this suggests that US power is not exactly what it was. There is a kind of fragility. That's the reason why Blinken is on this Africa tour, trying to strong arm people to come on side, as it were. People are refusing, they just don't want to. Well, that's why fragility is important. I just think that there's too much conversation about the decline of the US or the maintenance of US power. It's too much. People speak with too much certainty. Okay. And I believe that we are in slightly uncharted territory now. We're in an era not of certainty, but of contradictions. And I think when you're in an era of contradictions, it really behooves us to look carefully at different empirical moments rather than to have, like, the cookie cutter attitude towards world affairs. Got to look at this place and that place and try to understand, what is the kind of space for maneuver. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has created space for maneuver, so he can say, I'm not coming to the summit of the Americas. He's not a far left radical. He's a Mexican nationalist. Yes, left of center and so on. So I feel like in this era of contradictions, one has to understand the United States quite precisely. That's the reason why I believe when Nancy Pelosi's plane flew into Taipei, that's the reason why I feel, and it's not just that the Chinese are reticent to act, because as Noam said, the day after she left, they locked down Taiwan. The reason the Chinese didn't act, they could easily have put up 2 jet planes and dogged her flight as it entered Taiwanese airspace, or they could have done even something more dramatic, something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, placed 5 planes flying over Taipei airport, very scary stuff. They didn't do that. And I think they have a pretty accurate read that the United States is fragile, but it's not in deep decline. We've got to understand things precisely in order to be able to act. You can understand things more precisely than you act, but you got to have as near precision. And I think the term fragile is far more accurate than the word decline.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you. I have another interview coming up.
You're booked back to back.
Let me just say one last thing before we close up, if I may.
Okay.
Noam Chomsky is an incredible guy. And I want people to read this book because I asked Noam a question about how he keeps going, despite the attacks and so on. Forget the rest of the book. Just get the book to read that answer because it's hilarious.
It's very good. Something about stubbornness. But I guess that's... Yeah, go ahead.
That the attacks are a compliment. When the journals lie about you, defame you, that shows you must be doing something right. So keep at it.
Yeah, I guess you're not a thorn in anyone's side if you're not irritating them.
Yeah. Okay, great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Noam Chomsky. And thank you, Vijay Prashad. It was wonderful talking to you both.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.